The loudspeaker echoed through the vast expanse of Terminal C, announcing the final boarding call for Flight 247 to Chicago. Ethan Ross, a man in his early 40s with a rugged build and a determined look in his eyes, glanced at his wristwatch. 20 minutes left. Just 20 minutes to seize the opportunity he had waited for nearly his entire life. His worn leather shoes made soft tapping sounds on the polished tile floor as he strode quickly. The heavy backpack on his shoulders pressed down on muscles long accustomed to the strain of fixing machines in a small-town garage. Inside that backpack was more than just his only neatly pressed dress shirt. Several copies of his resume printed on the best quality paper he could afford, and a thick notebook filled with questions, ideas, and strengths that he had painstakingly prepared through countless sleepless nights. This wasn't just any job interview. This was the opportunity that could completely transform his life. A mid-level mechanic position at Midwest Motors, a prestigious company he had never believed would notice someone like him. A long-term contract, full health benefits, paid vacation, things Ethan had never dared to dream of in his 15 years of anonymous labor. At 42, he knew he didn't have many chances left to start over. Every step toward Gate 32 wasn't just a race against time. It was a race against fate. But life has a way of twisting the path, and sometimes the biggest challenge isn't the distance, but the choice you make when time doesn't allow for hesitation. That's when his eyes caught sight of her. An elderly woman struggling near the security area. Her silver hair was tied back in a bun, and she wore a faded blue wool coat. 3 mismatched suitcases sat around her feet. No one stopped, not a single look of compassion. An airport employee hurried past. A businessman with a sleek rolling suitcase steered around her, and a family with young kids rushed by as if she didn't exist. Ethan froze for a split second. He glanced at his watch. 18 minutes. It was still possible if he didn't stop. Then he saw her trying to lift the largest suitcase onto the conveyor belt. Her frail hands trembled. Her wrinkled face tightened from the effort. Inside Ethan, a storm of emotions rose. A battle between his hunger for a better future and the quiet voice of conscience. Damn it, he muttered and turned toward Gate 32, but toward the old woman. "Ma'am, can I give you a hand?" he said with a gentle smile as he approached. Her clear blue eyes widened in surprise, as if she couldn't believe that, in this rushing world, someone had actually stopped. "Oh, thank you, young man," she replied, her voice soft and refined, but not haughty. "These bags seem to get heavier." Ethan lifted the suitcase with ease. He kept a smile on his face, though his mind was racing, counting down the seconds. "Traveling somewhere nice?" he asked casually. "Not really, just a business trip. But at my age everything starts to blur together," she said, her gaze drifting off into the distance, lost in thought. They made their way through security together. Ethan noticed that the woman, who introduced herself only as Margaret, moved slowly. Every time she had to lift her arms for the scanner, she winced in pain. It was a small gesture, but for someone who worked with his hands for a living, Ethan couldn't ignore it. He wondered if anyone else had ever noticed her quiet struggle. "Where are you headed after security?" he asked, helping her gather her belongings. Margaret fumbled in her purse and pulled out a crumpled boarding pass. "Gate 47B. Somewhere around there, I think." Ethan's heart sank. 47B was in Terminal D across the airport, far from Gate 32. He looked at his watch. 15 minutes. If he left now, he'd still make it. He could just wish her well and walk away. He could. "That's a long walk," he said instead, slowly. "Let me help you get there." Margaret paused, clearly touched. In her eyes flickered a mix of gratitude and surprise. "Are you sure? I don't want to be a burden." "It's no problem," Ethan replied, trying to mask the tightness in his chest. His steps slowed, matching hers. Every step away from Gate 32 felt like walking further from the life he'd been hoping for. But deep down he knew, sometimes the right thing is the hardest thing to do. Ethan carefully picked up Margaret's lightest suitcase. His pace fell in line with hers, slow but steady. A voice echoed in his mind, his mother's. We weren't put on this earth just for ourselves. We're here to look out for one another. Every step down the crowded airport hallway was a tug of war between the ticking clock and something deeper. Something that came from his core. And as he walked, he noticed Margaret watching him, not just looking, but seeing something in him no one else had noticed in years. "You're very kind," she said as they paused to rest under the softer light of a quiet corner. "Not many people stop for others anymore." Ethan shrugged, hiding the anxiety bubbling beneath his calm exterior. "Just doing what anyone should." "But they don't," she said, almost sadly. "That's why you're different." Her words, soft as they were, cut deep into Ethan's soul. For years he believed kindness was basic human instinct, not something rare. But maybe, in today's world, it truly was one of the last priceless things left. As they passed a coffee stand, Margaret slowed and gripped the handrail gently. "I'm feeling a little dizzy. I rushed so much this morning I forgot to eat." Ethan looked at his watch. Only 10 minutes left. Even if he sprinted now, making his flight was a long shot. "Let me get you something," he said, setting the suitcase down. "Tea? Maybe a sandwich?" "Just tea would be lovely. But please, let me pay." Ethan shook his head. "It's on me. You just sit and rest." He returned with a steaming cup of tea and a warm blueberry muffin. They looked fresh out of the oven. He smiled as he handed them to her. Margaret accepted them with both hands, her eyes warm with sincere gratitude, something so real it melted a part of Ethan's guarded heart. "Are you here for work?" she asked between careful sips. "Yes," Ethan replied. "A job interview in Chicago. It's a big one." "What time is your flight?" Ethan glanced at the departure board in the distance. "Flight 247. Final boarding," blinked in bold red letters. His expression must have given him away. "Oh no, you're missing your flight because of me, aren't you?" Ethan forced a small smile. "There will be other flights." He didn't say that he had spent the last 3 months saving for that ticket. The truth wouldn't help anyone right now. "But your interview, I'll figure something out." He stood and lifted her suitcase again. "Let's get you to your gate." By the time they reached gate 47B, flight 247 had already departed. Ethan said nothing. The emptiness inside him wasn't regret. It was something quieter, deeper, like watching a dream slip out of reach. He helped Margaret into a seat, double-checked her ticket and ID, and then something caught him off guard. "You're in first class?" he asked, eyebrows raised. Margaret chuckled softly, her eyes sparkling. "A little late in life luxury I allow myself." "You're all set," Ethan said, his voice now tinged with fatigue. "They'll start boarding in about 40 minutes. He turned to leave, his mind already running through possible next steps. Calling the company to reschedule the interview, sleeping overnight at the airport, or heading home to ask for his old job back at the garage. "Wait," Margaret called out. "I never got your name." "Ethan?" "Ethan Ross." "Thank you, Ethan Ross." She reached out and gave his hand a surprisingly firm squeeze. Strong and full of life, despite her aged appearance. "I won't forget you." Ethan nodded, throat tight, unable to speak further. He walked away slowly, his heart heavy. Eventually, he found an empty wooden bench near the baggage claim area. He slumped down, leaned back against the cold wall, and reached for his phone to make a call. But it was dead. A crushing blow of reality hit him like a punch. He'd missed his flight, lost the interview, and his bank account probably didn't hold enough for a second chance. Ethan sat in silence, drowning in a sense of helplessness. His backpack served as a lumpy pillow, and his dream faded like a distant star retreating into the night. He drifted off in exhaustion as the airport gradually emptied. Soft yellow lights stretched across the floor, casting long, solitary shadows on the walls. Ethan woke with a start, his neck stiff from an awkward sleeping position. The terminal was now quiet. Through the large windows, the night had fully settled. He checked his watch. 8:37 p.m. He had been asleep for nearly 4 hours. He sighed heavily, remembering his dead phone, and the weight of reality came crashing back like a cold wave. The lost opportunity, the empty wallet, and now, just a middle-aged man with nowhere to go and no reason to turn back. The janitor silently pushed a trash cart past him, glancing at Ethan with a look of quiet sympathy, like one might give to someone sleeping rough for the night. And in a way, that was exactly what Ethan was. No ticket, no plan, no hope. Outside the window, a pair of headlights cut through the darkness. Fate, it seemed, was knocking again. Outside the terminal, the steady stream of shuttles continued ferrying late travelers to their final flights. Amidst the yellow taxis and crowded rideshares, a sleek black luxury car glided to a precise stop beneath the bright glow of the main entrance lights. The driver, dressed in a crisp uniform, stepped out and opened the rear door with practiced grace. At first, Ethan didn't pay much attention. Everything around him felt like a blur. Fatigue, and the slow seep of defeat into every joint, until he saw her. Her silver hair was neatly styled, the old faded blue coat replaced by a deep burgundy cashmere shawl, and a strand of pearls gleamed at her collar. But the eyes, those sharp, deep blue eyes, were unmistakable. It was Margaret. Ethan blinked, wondering if hunger and lack of sleep were making him hallucinate. Surely she'd boarded her flight, right? He sat upright, instinctively straightening his posture, even though his shirt was wrinkled and his hair a mess. Still, he didn't stand. Just watched, silently, unsure if he belonged in the world this woman now seemed to command. But then something happened that made his chest tighten. Margaret looked around the terminal as if searching for someone, and when her gaze found him, her face lit up with familiar warmth. She spoke briefly to the driver, who nodded and stepped back into the car, then walked confidently toward the bench where Ethan sat, no trace of the frailty he had seen earlier that day. "I figured you might still be here," she said without preamble. Ethan scrambled to his feet, running a hand through his hair. "Miss Margaret, I thought you'd be halfway across the world by now." Plans changed. Margaret smiled, serene and cryptic, as though her return wasn't surprising at all, to her, at least. She offered no further explanation. As she approached, Ethan noticed something different, not just her outfit or composure. It was her presence, a kind of gravity he couldn't define, but that made him feel smaller in his wrinkled shirt and scuffed shoes. "And you?" she asked softly. "Still here because—" Ethan sighed, trying to sound casual, trying to figure out what comes next. "My phone's dead, and the interview is— well, I guess that's gone." "The interview in Chicago." Margaret finished his sentence. "The one you missed because you walked an old woman to her gate." Ethan gave a tired shrug and a half-hearted smile. "Like I said, there'll be other chances." But the words rang hollow, even to his own ears, as if he no longer believed them himself. Margaret studied him quietly for a moment, her gaze peeling back every layer of doubt and defensiveness he wore like armor. "What if there was a way to get you to Chicago tonight?" Ethan blinked. "Tonight? I don't follow. I'm flying there. Right now, on my private jet," Margaret said, as if she were offering him a ride to the grocery store. It took a moment for the sentence to fully register in Ethan's mind. "Private jet?" he echoed, stunned. Who exactly are you?" "The lucky woman who had the privilege of your kindness this morning," Margaret said warmly. "And now I'd like to return the favor." A small gesture of appreciation. Ethan stood frozen, "Ms. Margaret, that's too much. I can't accept that." "You can. And I want you to." Her tone was gentle but firm. "You did something no one else did. You stopped for a stranger. You bought tea. You noticed when I was unwell. You never once checked your watch, even when you thought I wasn't looking." She placed her hand on his arm, her gaze deep and unwavering. "Sometimes, the way a person behaves when no one is watching is all you need to know about them." Ethan stayed silent. His thoughts were racing. It all seemed too fast, too surreal. A part of him wondered, was this some kind of setup, a cruel joke? But then he looked into her eyes, and all he saw there was sincerity, generosity, and something rarer than both: trust. I'm not exactly dressed for..." He glanced down at his old clothes, then up at her sophisticated appearance. Margaret laughed, a full, youthful laugh that sparkled like morning light. "My jet doesn't care what you're wearing, young man." And just like that, despite all the questions, Ethan followed her to the car. The driver, James, she called him, took Ethan's battered backpack with the care one might reserve for a high-end briefcase, and the door to a new destiny slowly began to open. Ethan's worn-out backpack was placed gently in the car trunk by James, the chauffeur, with the same care one might use when handling luxury luggage. There was no look of pity, no intrusive questions, just a quiet dignity reserved for someone personally invited by his employer. As the car pulled away from the terminal, Ethan glanced back at the bench where, just minutes ago, he had sat hunched over in a sleep weighed down by disappointment. A strange feeling rose within him, like he had just stepped into a turn in the road he never even knew existed. "You still have that interview tomorrow morning, right?" Margaret asked, her tone calm but firm. "I do, but I don't think..." "Good. We'll get you there on time," she said, cutting him off naturally. She pulled out a sleek, high-end smartphone, nicer than anything Ethan had ever held. "Charles, we're on our way. 2 passengers tonight." The car didn't head toward the regular terminals, but turned down a private road leading to the executive jet section. At a separate hangar, a pristine white aircraft was already waiting, its stairs lowered, the polished exterior gleaming under the lights like glass. "Is that..." Ethan stammered, unable to finish the question. "Our transportation," Margaret answered simply, stepping out of the car with James's help. "Come on, Ethan. Chicago's waiting." Still not quite believing any of this was real, Ethan followed her silently. Just above the aircraft door, he caught a glimpse of a sleek logo, a bird in flight, with stylized lettering below. A new world was opening before him, just one step away. Inside, Ethan was completely overwhelmed. He had expected luxury seating and some privacy, but what unfolded before him looked more like the living room of a high-end penthouse than the interior of a jet. Cream leather seats, soft as butter, polished wood tables, warm ambient lighting, and the subtle fragrance of fresh flowers on every surface. It was all so refined he almost hesitated to enter. A flight attendant in a crisp navy uniform stepped forward to greet them. "Good evening, Miss Hale. Everything is ready as requested." "Thank you, Rebecca." Margaret nodded. "This is Mr. Ross. He'll be joining us on our flight to Chicago." Rebecca smiled warmly. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Ross. May I take your jacket?" Ethan awkwardly shrugged off his faded denim jacket, trying to hide the coffee stain on the t-shirt underneath. He muttered a quick thanks, his heart full of embarrassment and a gnawing sense that he didn't belong here. "Make yourself comfortable," Margaret said, gesturing to one of the spacious seats. "We'll be taking off shortly." Ethan sat down slowly, his heart pounding. He half expected someone to come in and tell him he didn't belong, but no one did. Everything felt real, strangely, undeniably real. He ran his fingers over the leather armrest, so soft it made his chest ache, like he was touching something he'd always believed was beyond his reach. Instead of the standard seatbelts he was used to, there were elegant harnesses, which Rebecca gently showed him how to fasten. "Would you like something to drink before takeoff?" Rebecca asked. "We have wine, champagne, cocktails, or non-alcoholic options." Ethan glanced at Margaret, who sat across from him, silver hair glowing under the cabin lights. She smiled encouragingly. "Just water, please," Ethan said. This wasn't the time for alcohol, to dull the edges of what was quickly becoming an unbelievable reality. "Champagne for me, Rebecca." "The Balinja," Margaret said smoothly, her voice confident and composed. While Rebecca prepared the drinks, Ethan took in more of the cabin. There were only 6 passenger seats, arranged in pairs facing one another. Toward the rear was what looked like a small conference area, with a large screen and a discreet minibar tucked behind a frosted glass panel. Every detail was impeccably designed, understated but impossible to overlook. "First time on a private jet?" Margaret asked. Though the answer was obvious, Ethan chuckled nervously. "That obvious, huh? There's nothing wrong with new experiences," she replied, accepting her champagne from Rebecca. "In fact, I find them essential to growth." The pilot's voice came through the speakers, announcing their imminent departure. Beneath them, Ethan felt the engines come to life, not with the roar he was used to on commercial flights, but with a deep, steady hum, like a giant heartbeat lifting them gently from the earth. He turned toward Margaret, still full of questions. But instead of asking one, he spoke softly, trying to hold on to the surreal moment taking shape around him. "Do you do this often? Midnight flights, picking up strangers, changing lives. You fly private often?" Ethan asked, his voice both hesitant and curious. "And picking up strangers sleeping at airport benches?" Margaret smiled, her eyes twinkling with a rare kind of mischief not often seen in someone who had lived through so many seasons. "Flying private? Often. Picking up strangers? First time," she said. Then, almost as a whisper, she added, "But I believe kindness deserves to be acknowledged in a world that's growing colder by the day." The jet began its ascent. There was no screeching of wheels, no harsh turbulence. Just a graceful lift, as if invisible hands were carrying Ethan away from the ground and into a new chapter. On the silver tray Rebecca brought over, the aroma of food filled the cabin, making Ethan's stomach twist with hunger. He hadn't realized he hadn't eaten since that rushed breakfast. Just a dry sandwich and a lukewarm cup of coffee. "We've prepared a light dinner as per Ms. Hale's request," Rebecca said. "Would you both like to dine now?" "Yes, thank you," Margaret nodded. "And, Rebecca, Mr. Ross will need a phone charger. I'll bring one right away." Dinner consisted of herb-crusted grilled fish and perfectly roasted vegetables, like something out of a fine French restaurant. Ethan nearly forgot he was on an airplane and not seated at a private dinner for the elite. As Rebecca arranged the meal, he noticed Margaret watching him, not critically, but with a quiet intensity, as if she were observing something she found meaningful. "Tell me about your interview tomorrow," she said as they began to eat. Ethan paused for a moment, then began to share. He spoke of his years working in a small garage in his hometown, how his father was the one who taught him how to listen to engines, how every machine had its own language, how his father would run his fingers across metal as if healing it, and how Ethan had learned not through manuals, but through feel. "Machines have souls too," Ethan said. "They have their own voices, and when you know their language, you can hear when something's wrong." Margaret listened silently, not out of politeness, but with genuine interest. "And what makes this new job different from your current one?" she asked. "It's not about being different, it's about being stable," Ethan admitted. "Health insurance, a few paid vacation days, saving enough to maybe buy a place of my own instead of renting forever." "Modest ambitions," Margaret noted. "I'm a modest guy too," Ethan shrugged, then gave a self-deprecating chuckle. Though saying that while eating grilled fish on a private jet feels kind of ironic. Margaret laughed. An honest, hearty laugh, the kind shared between old friends recalling a good story. "Perhaps modesty is a bit overrated," she said warmly. The meal ended with hot coffee. Ethan noticed how Margaret always addressed Rebecca by name, always thanked her with genuine eye contact. Not out of politeness, but from the quiet respect of someone who understood the value of service. When Rebecca returned with a phone charger, Ethan let out a relieved sigh. "You have no idea how grateful I am," he said, plugging it in like it was the last tether to his former world. "What will you tell them?" Margaret asked, after Rebecca walked away. Ethan gave a short, bitter laugh. "Probably not the truth. They'd think I was making excuses." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his worn leather wallet. Its edges were peeling slightly. From it, he drew a $20 bill, stood, and walked toward Rebecca, who was arranging glasses near the kitchenette. "For you," he said quietly, "just a small thank you for your help." When he returned to his seat, Margaret was watching him silently. The pause was long enough to make him uneasy. Then she said, "On a private jet, gratuities are usually handled by the principal passenger." Ethan flushed. "I'm sorry, it's not that I thought I had to. Where I come from, when you're grateful, you say so. You show it." Margaret smiled gently. "No need to apologize. It was a kind gesture." She took a sip of her coffee, then shifted the conversation unexpectedly. "Ethan, have you ever traveled abroad?" The question caught him off guard. "Not much. Canada once, for a car show. A weekend in Mexico, back in college. Travel can be expensive." Margaret nodded, her gaze drifting to the dark night outside the window. After a pause, she asked, "Have you ever heard of Hale Airlines?" Ethan furrowed his brow, thinking. "Sounds familiar. Newer airline, right? Started with domestic routes, expanded really fast." "That's right," Margaret nodded, her lips curling into a slight smile. "We've grown considerably over the last decade." She turned to him, her expression carrying subtle weight. "And in fact, you're currently flying on one of Hale Airline's executive aircraft. So you do this often? Flying private jets and picking up random strangers sleeping at airports?" Ethan asked, half joking. Margaret tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing with quiet amusement. "Flying private? All the time? Picking up strangers? This is a first." She paused, then added in a softer, sharper tone, "Because sometimes kindness deserves to be rewarded, especially in a world that so often ignores it." The plane continued gliding smoothly through the sky. Below, the city lights shrank into glittering constellations. Ethan stared out of the round window, eyes clouded as if trying to grasp something that didn't quite make sense yet. Margaret took a small sip of her coffee, then leaned toward him. Her blue eyes seemed to pierce through the tough layers he'd worn his whole life. "Ethan," she said slowly, "let me properly introduce myself. I'm Margaret Hale. I founded and still run Hale Airlines, the company you're flying with right now." The coffee cup froze in Ethan's hand. His mind paused, trying to reconcile the frail, elderly woman fumbling with her luggage that morning, with the poised executive calmly delivering the revelation before him now. "You're—" Ethan placed the cup down, his voice tight. "That's right. I'm the founder, CEO, and sole owner of Hale Airlines," Margaret confirmed. "This plane is part of my executive fleet." Ethan glanced around the cabin again, suddenly seeing it with new eyes. The embossed H logo on the seat backs, the polished detailing he'd barely noticed earlier, all now carried new meaning. Hale wasn't just a brand, it was her name. "But why? Why were you—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "Well, was I dressed like an ordinary person struggling with old luggage, walking through a public terminal like some helpless elderly woman?" Margaret smiled knowingly, completing his thought. "It's something I do once a year. I fly anonymously as a regular passenger on one of my own flights." Ethan sat still, The pieces in his mind were finally falling into place. "You were testing your staff," he said quietly, "to see how they treat everyday passengers." "Exactly," Margaret said, her eyes gleaming as if a student had just cracked a difficult riddle. "Internal reports and customer surveys only reveal so much. If you really want to understand your business, you have to live it as your customers do." Ethan swallowed hard. "And how did they do today?" Margaret's expression darkened, like a cloud drifting across the sun. "Not well," she admitted. "Not one person stopped. The ticket agent barely looked me in the eye. The flight attendant who passed me was scrolling through his social media. There will be changes, I can promise you that." A gentle jolt traveled through the cabin, causing Ethan's water glass to tremble. Neither of them reacted. What they were discussing now carried more weight than any turbulence. "But I wasn't only watching the employees," Margaret continued, her tone softening. "I was watching the passengers too. How they behave when they believe no one important is paying attention." Ethan shifted slightly in his seat, a strange cocktail of shame, confusion, and self-doubt rising in his chest. "Oh, I was part of your test?" "Not deliberately," Margaret said, her eyes now filled with genuine warmth. "But yes, you became an unexpected variable." She paused, as if carefully choosing her next words. "Either in the 15 years I've done this anonymous flight each year, do you know how many people have ever stopped to help me?" Ethan shook his head, feeling his heart tighten. "6, Margaret said softly. "Just 6 people in 15 years. And none of them ever went as far as you did today." Ethan looked down, his face flushed. I didn't do anything special. I just helped someone who needed help. You gave up your interview. You missed your flight, a flight you saved for, penny by penny. No one was watching. There was no reward. But you did it anyway, because it was the right thing to do." Ethan squirmed slightly. She was making something grand out of what he had always believed should be a given. But then Margaret added, gently but firmly, "No one else did, and that's what makes it extraordinary." Entered with a fresh cup of coffee. Even knowing Margaret's true identity, she remained flawlessly professional, no more, no less, and without any attempt to curry favor. Ethan realized, this is what Margaret truly valued, a sincere ecosystem, free of pretenses. As they sat facing each other again, Ethan took a deep breath, trying to piece together the emotions unraveling inside him. Alundus, bringing me along, the private jet, the meal, is it just to say thank you?" "In part," Margaret replied with a soft smile. "The other part, Ethan, is because I believe good people shouldn't have to walk alone in this world." She sipped her coffee, her gaze now illuminated not by elegance, but by a clear professional curiosity. "I'll admit, I'm a little curious, professionally speaking." Ethan tilted his head. "Curious about what?" "About you, Ethan Ross. Whether your mechanical talent matches your character." Ethan frowned. "I'm not sure I follow." Margaret smoothly shifted gears. "Then let me ask you this. What do you know about aircraft maintenance?" The question caught Ethan off guard. "Not much, to be honest, aside from basic principles. An engine is still an engine. Combustion, cooling systems, fuel intake. But aircraft have specialized systems I've never worked with directly. But if given the right training..." "You think you could learn?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "Absolutely. With proper guidance, I can learn any mechanical system." Margaret nodded, as if confirming something she had already assumed. "Did you know that most aircraft maintenance around the world takes place in just a few countries? The US, parts of Europe, Singapore, the UAE?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Probably because of infrastructure and funding?" "Exactly," Margaret replied, her tone approving. But that creates a major issue for emerging markets, Africa, South America, Southeast Asia. They have to fly their planes thousands of miles for routine maintenance. It's costly, inefficient, and ultimately unsustainable, with global air travel demand increasing. Ethan began to understand where the conversation was going, though the destination still felt unclear. 3 years ago, Margaret continued, I started developing a plan, a network of regional maintenance hubs in underserved areas, providing high-quality service at reasonable costs, while also training local workforces. Sounds like a solid, sustainable business model. Not just sustainable, Margaret sighed, but with real potential for social change. And yet, execution has been incredibly challenging. Because of the technical side? No, because of the people, Margaret said, looking him square in the eye. I need individuals who understand mechanical systems intuitively, who can teach others, and most importantly, who have integrity and humility. Skills can be taught. Character cannot. Her words landed on Ethan like a crossroads, suddenly appearing before him. Burgess Margaret, are you implying? I'm not implying anything. Yet, she said gently, though her eyes stayed locked on his. I'm simply telling you about my business challenges while we fly to Chicago. But her gaze said more. It was an unspoken invitation. Outside the window, the lights of Chicago began to twinkle into view, like stars beckoning him down. Ethan felt as though he were descending into a dream. Just hours ago, he was an unemployed mechanic who had missed his flight, and almost his future. Now, a path he'd never imagined was being offered by one of the most powerful women in commercial aviation. We'll be landing soon, Margaret said quietly. Rebecca will arrange transport to your hotel. Ethan tightened his fingers slightly. Thank you for everything. For this, he gestured vaguely, as if trying to gather the plane, the coffee, and the whole surreal evening into a single sentence. But words weren't enough. Margaret smiled. Our conversation isn't over, Ethan Ross. But I believe sleep clears the mind before important decisions, even when you've just basically offered me an entirely different opportunity. Margaret laughed, her eyes shimmering with unspoken meaning. Options. Sometimes they're the most powerful thing a person can have. She pulled out a business card. Remarkably simple. No title, no email, no office address. Just her name, the company logo, and a phone number. Call this number after your interview tomorrow. We'll continue the conversation then. The aircraft touched down with barely a bump, the pilot's expertise unmistakable. As they taxied toward the private terminal, Ethan found himself wondering whether he'd ever see the inside of a cabin like this again. As if reading his thoughts, Margaret said softly, her eyes on the floodlights lining the runway. Sometimes, Ethan, life changes direction at the most unexpected moment. The question is, do we have the courage to change with it? The next morning, Ethan sat at the hotel desk. In front of him was the offer letter from Midwest Motors, with a starting salary of $162,000, 0 cents per year, a raise from the original offer, full benefits, 2 weeks of paid vacation, clear room for advancement. A few weeks ago, it was everything he had dreamed of. But now, his eyes drifted to the small business card lying quietly next to the hotel phone. Like a heartbeat waiting to be awakened. Outside the window, Chicago moved like any other day. But for Ethan Ross, today was the kind of day where every path lay open, and with every step forward, he was choosing a new destiny. He had asked for 24 hours to decide, a request that had clearly surprised the recruiter. 6 months ago, he would have signed immediately, without hesitation. But now, he couldn't stop thinking about Margaret Hale. At exactly 7 p.m., the familiar black car pulled up outside the hotel. Ethan was taken to a private restaurant located atop one of Chicago's tallest skyscrapers. The city stretched out below them like a glowing tapestry, pulsing with life. Margaret stood by the tall glass window, her silver hair illuminated by the warm interior lighting, casting a soft halo around her. Beautiful, isn't it? she said without turning. From up here, you can see possibilities that never quite reveal themselves on the ground. It's breathtaking, Ethan admitted, stepping up beside her. I've heard about your interview, Margaret said, as she finally turned to face him. They've made you an offer. Thank you. It's a good opportunity, Ethan said, unsurprised that she knew. Is it really? Margaret looked at him as if peering into his soul. Or is it simply better than what you've had before? The question threw Ethan off. Isn't that how progress works? One step at a time, each one a little higher? Margaret smiled. Sometimes, yes, but sometimes life gives us an elevator instead of stairs. She motioned toward the elegantly set dining table. As they ate, Margaret finally revealed her true purpose. Airlines is launching a global initiative, she said, unfolding a map across the table. A network of aircraft maintenance facilities in developing nations. Kenya, Brazil, Vietnam, Indonesia. Her finger traced lines connecting continents, as though building the future with action rather than words. They'll initially serve our fleet, she explained, but eventually will expand to service other airlines as well. More importantly, it's about building a sustainable aviation ecosystem, training local technicians, providing long-term economic stability. Ethan nodded. That's ambitious, not just ambitious. Necessary, Margaret said with conviction. Aviation connects the world, but access remains deeply unequal. We can change that. After a pause, Ethan asked. And what does this have to do with me? Margaret leaned in. I need someone to lead the technical training program. Someone who understands machines instinctively, who can teach without condescension, who inspires without needing to feel superior. Ethan's pulse quickened. But you barely know me. I don't need to know more than I've already seen, Margaret replied. You gave up a professional opportunity for a stranger. You treated service staff with dignity, even when you thought no one was paying attention. You've worked hard your whole life without recognition. She slid a folder across the table. Inside was a contract with a salary 3 times what Midwest Motors had offered. Ethan's jaw dropped. This isn't charity, Margaret said, anticipating his reaction. It's an investment. Your character is a rare asset, and I don't intend to let it go to waste. I don't know anything about planes. You'll spend 6 months training at our technical center in Seattle. Housing, relocation assistance, it's all covered. Margaret tapped the folder. Then you'll go to Nairobi, our first training hub. You'll select apprentices, develop the curriculum, and build your team. You want me to move to Kenya? Ethan could barely get the words out. I want you to help build something extraordinary, Margaret corrected. And after that, we expand to South America and Southeast Asia. There will be challenges, isolation, change, but you'll change thousands of lives, including your own. But why me? Ethan whispered. There must be hundreds of people more qualified. Qualifications can be taught, experience can be gained, but character? Margaret paused. That cannot be manufactured. You can't teach someone to do the right thing when no one's watching. She turned back to the window, watching the city sparkle below. The job at Midwest Motors is safe, stable. You do well there. But it's a job. What I'm offering is a mission. Ethan stepped beside her. It sounds impossible. Everything worth doing does at first. She looked at him. Yesterday, you helped an old woman carry her bags. Today, I'm asking you to help lift entire communities. What if I fail? Margaret smiled. Then again, what if you succeed for the first time? Ethan truly saw it. Young trainees in Kenya, their eyes lighting up when they heard the perfect engine sound for the first time. Hands mastering skills they once thought were unreachable. Families building a future from work they never thought possible. I need to think, Ethan murmured. Of course, Margaret said gently. Though I suspect you've been thinking about this since the moment we stepped off the plane. She handed him a pen. Sign it, and your new journey begins next week. Or don't. and the car will take you back to your hotel. No pressure, the choice is yours." She stepped away, leaving him alone with the pen and the contract, a piece of paper that felt heavier in his hand than any tool he had ever held. Ethan stared down at it. Then he thought of his father, the man who taught him to hear the breath of steel, to feel an engine with his heart. His father once told him, "Sometimes you don't choose the opportunity chooses you." And now, the opportunity was calling him, with the voice of a silver-hailed woman who had seen something in him he'd forgotten he had. Ethan gripped the pen. Inside, Ethan had always known the sound of a failing engine. He could hear the dry stutter, the strain, the call for repair. But he'd never imagined that one small decision, stopping to help a stranger with her luggage, would be the first step in restoring a dream he thought had died. That day, he was just a small-town mechanic, tethered to the same tools, the same broken-down cars, the same endless loop that dulled his youthful ambition. And then, with one signature, Ethan began writing a new story. 18 months later, Ethan stood silently on the observation deck of the Hale Aviation Training Center, now fully operational in the outskirts of Nairobi. The early morning sun cast long shadows from the 3 aircraft lined up on the tarmac for maintenance checks. Through the massive windows below, he watched his team, 30 Kenyan technicians, each one trained and mentored by him, moving with confidence and precision. "Impressive operation, Mr. Ross," came a warm voice from his right. It was Daniel Kimani, Kenya's Minister of Transport. "From blueprint to a functioning facility in under 2 years, Ethan smiled. "I just helped bring the vision to life. The real credit goes to the team and, of course, to Miss Hale." Speaking of which, Daniel glanced down at the entrance area, where a familiar car had just pulled up. Ethan immediately felt his heart skip a beat. Despite numerous meetings and visits, Margaret Hale still had a presence that made those who encountered her feel as though they were in the presence of something greater than themselves. She stepped out of the car with a composed demeanor. Her light-colored linen suit suited Kenya's gentle sunshine. At 73, her movements were more deliberate, but her sharp gaze remained unchanged. The same eyes that once saw through Ethan in a moment he hadn't even realized he was being observed. "Minister Kimani," she greeted warmly, shaking his hand. "Thank you for attending the ceremony in person. How could I miss it? This facility has created over 100 jobs, and I hear you've just secured your first contract beyond Hale Airlines." "Ethiopian Airways," Margaret confirmed. "The first 3 aircraft will arrive next week." Truly commendable. After the minister departed to prepare for the ceremony, Margaret turned to Ethan. Her eyes quickly scanned his new uniform, the Hale badge on his left chest, his sun-kissed skin from months under the African sun. His posture no longer resembled the man who once sat despondently at the airport. He now carried the bearing of a leader. "You look as if you were born to be here," she observed. Ethan chuckled. "Most days, I feel that way too, though it's still hard to believe how much everything has changed." Margaret gazed out over the expansive facility below. Workshops, classrooms, dormitories, the newly extended runway. "Any regrets about leaving the safe path behind?" Ethan paused for a moment, then shook his head. "No, though I occasionally wonder, why did you place such trust in someone like me?" Margaret smirked, her eyes gleaming with humor and pride. "I've built my entire career on well-calculated bets, and Ethan, you were one of the best gambles I've ever made." An assistant approached, announcing that the ceremony was about to begin. Before they entered the elevator, Margaret paused and pulled out a small box. "I have a gift for you," she said, placing the silver box in Ethan's hand. Inside was an exquisite keychain, a miniature silver suitcase engraved with the date they first met, The day Ethan missed his flight to help a stranger. "This suitcase is easier to carry than the one we met over," she joked softly, her eyes twinkling. Ethan laughed, his heart tightening with emotion for the first time in months. "I think that's the most valuable luggage I've ever helped with." Now, as they stepped into the elevator, preparing to head to the inauguration ceremony where hundreds awaited, Ethan Ross was no longer a small-town mechanic, no longer the man who missed a flight due to a moment of kindness. He was someone who had chosen a path few dared to tread, and in return, had brought an entire community along with him toward a brighter future. Hundreds gathered outside the main workshop. Government officials, airline representatives, graduates from the first training class, and local residents. The atmosphere was filled with pride, excitement, and something Ethan could only describe as hope. On the large doors of the training center, a gleaming brass plaque was covered by a white silk cloth, awaiting the momentous unveiling. As he and Margaret approached the podium, Ethan glanced toward his small office through the frosted glass window. His name etched on the glass, technical drawings scattered across the desk, and a photo with Margaret from the day he completed his training in Seattle. The Minister of Transport began the opening remarks, praising the center's initiative and its positive impact on Kenya's aviation industry. Ethan listened half-heartedly, his mind drifting back to the image of himself sitting on a hard bench at the airport, believing his life's dream had just shattered. "I am honored to invite Miss Margaret Hale and Mr. Ethan Ross to unveil the curtain inaugurating this special training center." Thunderous applause erupted as they pulled the red cord. The plaque was revealed, bearing the embossed brass inscription, "Hale Aviation Training Center, Nairobi, where kindness sows the seeds of opportunity." That inscription. A personal decision by Margaret, one she defended against all marketing department advice. After the ceremony, the two walked among the crowd, receiving congratulations and expressions of gratitude. Margaret gently linked her arm with Ethan's, a maternal gesture of closeness. "Do you know what I'm most proud of?" she asked softly. "The training program, the new contracts, the expansion into the East African market," Ethan guessed. Margaret shook her head, her eyes sparkling. "It's that I still have the ability to see the true essence of people. You've exceeded all expectations, Ethan." She paused, looking at him intently. "The next facility in Sao Paulo, it's yours, if you want it." Ethan felt his chest swell with a mix of gratitude and an indescribable emotion. He could only respond sincerely, "I would be honored." As Margaret prepared to depart, she stood beside the car, glancing back at her facility, where young technicians laughed in their uniforms, where light reflected off the latest technology in the workshop. "It's the smallest actions that most clearly reflect a person's character," she murmured, as if speaking to herself. "You never know who's watching, or when a simple act of kindness might change everything." Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the future, yet his heart filled with reflection. He thought about the people depending on the work here, their families, the passengers who would fly safely thanks to his and his students' diligence, even if they would never know his name. "Safe travels, Margaret," Ethan said as she stepped into the car. "See you in Vietnam in 3 months, she replied, smiling before rolling down the car window. And then, just as when they first met, she said to him, "And Ethan, thank you for helping me with my luggage that day." He stood there, watching the car disappear from view, then turned around. Behind him was not just a training center. It was a symbol of a timely choice, a beginning born from kindness, and a path leading to a meaning no one had anticipated. Somewhere in an airport at this very moment, someone might be facing a choice between haste and compassion. Ethan hoped they would choose as he once did, because sometimes a missed flight is actually the ticket to one's life's mission.